The day was finally here. Emily had been dreaming of her wedding day for years. She had spent months planning every detail, from the flowers to the dress, to make sure everything would go perfectly. The venue was stunning. A grand ballroom adorned with elegant decorations. The air was filled with the soft hum of laughter and cheerful conversations as guests gathered to celebrate the love between Emily and her groom, Alex. It seemed like a fairy tale. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm golden glow through the windows. Emily felt like the luckiest woman in the world as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her veil one last time. Her heart raced with excitement. This was the moment she had waited for. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But as the clock ticked closer to the ceremony, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Her excitement was slowly being replaced with a sense of unease. Alex, her soon-to-be husband, had been distant all day. She had tried to brush it off, thinking he was just nervous. After all, weddings were stressful for everyone, right? But as they went through the preparations for the ceremony, Emily couldn't ignore the tension between them. It wasn't just the usual pre-wedding nerves. Alex's smile seemed forced, and his responses to her seemed distracted. He wasn't the man she knew. And while Emily had tried to brush it off, her instincts told her that something was wrong. Throughout the ceremony, as the guests watched them exchange vows, Emily tried to focus on the words being spoken, but she couldn't help but notice how distant Alex seemed. His eyes didn't sparkle the way they usually did when he looked at her. Instead, he seemed lost in his thoughts, as if something was weighing heavily on his mind. She tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach, but no one else seemed to notice. The guests were too busy enjoying the moment, admiring the beautiful bride and groom. The photographer snapped pictures, and the band played joyful music. Alex tried to smile for the guests, but Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, his stiff posture. She even overheard a few whispers between friends who noticed how different things felt. During the reception, things didn't improve. Emily tried to push away the discomfort, determined to enjoy the night. But the more she tried to relax, the more she noticed Alex withdrawing. It wasn't just the wedding, though. She had seen glimpses of this behavior in him before, but she had never paid much attention. Little things that had bothered her over the months, but she had brushed them aside because she was so caught up in the excitement of getting married. Tonight, it seemed like everything was coming to the surface. As the guests gathered around for the cake cutting, Emily hoped that the ceremony would bring some cheer to the night. She smiled nervously, hoping Alex would pull himself together for just this one moment. But as they approached the cake, the tension between them was almost unbearable. Emily's mind raced, unsure of what to expect, and her heart began to sink. Something wasn't right. The wedding cake, a beautiful creation with delicate layers of frosting and intricate decorations, sat on the table in front of them. It was time to cut it, as tradition went, to share with everyone and mark the beginning of their life together. Emily reached for the knife with a smile, hoping this simple moment would ease the tension in the air. But what happened next was far from what she could have imagined. As the evening wore on, the excitement of the wedding started to fade, replaced by an unsettling feeling that lingered in the air. Emily couldn't ignore the growing discomfort inside her. She had always thought of her wedding day as a joyful celebration, a moment to share with the person she loved most. But tonight, something felt different. Alex's mood had changed significantly over the course of the day. It wasn't just the usual wedding jitters. There was something deeper at play. The way he had looked at her during their vows didn't seem the same. It wasn't the loving gaze she was used to, the one that made her heart flutter. Instead, his eyes seemed distant, as if his mind was somewhere else. Emily had tried to chalk it up to nerves. Maybe he was just feeling overwhelmed by the weight of the commitment they were making. After all, marriage was a big step. But as the reception continued, Emily noticed the small things. Alex wasn't as engaged in the conversations with their guests. He barely laughed at the jokes, and when Emily tried to share a moment with him, something as simple as a smile or a glance. He seemed distracted. He kept his distance, both physically and emotionally, leaving Emily to wonder if she had somehow done something wrong. Throughout their relationship, Alex had always been warm and caring. They had built their relationship on trust, understanding, and a mutual respect that had made their bond strong. But tonight, all of that seemed to be slipping away. Emily tried to stay positive, telling herself that maybe it was just the pressure of the day getting to him. She knew weddings were stressful, and maybe he just needed some time to unwind. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the growing concern in her chest. As she walked around the room, greeting friends and family, she tried to brush off her worries, but they kept coming back. The way Alex had been acting all evening was starting to feel like more than just nerves. The question swirled in her mind. Had she done something to upset him? Was he regretting the wedding? Was he having second thoughts? She tried to put those thoughts out of her mind, but they kept creeping back in. When the cake-cutting ceremony was announced, Emily tried to shake off the unease that had settled in her stomach. She took a deep breath, smiling for the guests, hoping that this moment would help reset the mood. After all, weddings were supposed to be about joy and love, right? The cake, which was a beautiful, multi-layered creation decorated with delicate frosting flowers, was supposed to symbolize the sweetness of their life together. It was a simple tradition, a happy moment that they could share with everyone. But as they approached the cake, Emily couldn't help but notice that Alex seemed more distant than ever. He wasn't smiling the way he usually did. His face looked tense, his jaw clenched tightly, and there was a shadow in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. She tried to make light of it, thinking maybe he was just getting nervous about being the center of attention. But as Emily picked up the knife to cut the first piece of cake, she felt a sharp pang of doubt. She glanced over at Alex, hoping for some reassurance, but instead, she saw the conflict in his eyes. There was something brewing beneath the surface, something that had been building all day. She had no idea what was coming next, but in that moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. As Emily reached for the knife to cut the wedding cake, a tense silence seemed to fall over the room. The guests, all eagerly waiting for the traditional moment, watched with smiles on their faces, expecting a sweet and joyful scene. Emily took a deep breath, hoping that this simple act would break the tension that had been building up throughout the evening. But as she looked at Alex, her smile faltered. He wasn't smiling back. Instead, he stood there, his eyes fixed on her, his face hard and unreadable. Emily felt a slight chill run down her spine. There was something in the way he was looking at her, something different. It wasn't the look of a loving groom sharing a moment with his bride. It was something colder, almost distant. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just nerves. After all, weddings could be overwhelming for both the bride and the groom. But just as she was about to slice into the cake, Alex's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed, and without warning, he reached out and knocked the cake from her hands. The moment happened so quickly that Emily barely had time to react. In a shocking burst of frustration, Alex grabbed a handful of the cake and, before anyone could say a word, smashed it directly into Emily's face. Gasps filled the room. The guests, who had been eagerly waiting for the ceremony's next sweet moment, were now frozen in shock. Emily stood there, her face covered in cake, unable to process what had just happened. It felt like the world had paused for a moment. Her heart raced as she wiped her eyes, trying to clear away the thick layers of frosting that now coated her face. For a moment, she stood still, unsure of what to do. Her mind was reeling with disbelief. How could Alex, the man she was about to marry, do something like this? The cake, which was supposed to be a symbol of their new life together, now felt like an insult. The laughter that had once filled the room had turned to whispers and uncomfortable glances. Emily could feel the eyes of their friends and family on her, but it didn't matter. She only had one focus now: Alex. He stood there, staring at her, his face a mixture of anger and regret. Emily could see the frustration in his eyes, but it didn't make sense. What had triggered such a reaction? Was it something she had done? The questions raced through her mind, but there was no answer. She felt a surge of emotions: hurt, confusion, disbelief. How had things gone from bad to worse so quickly? The room remained eerily quiet, and all eyes were on Emily, waiting to see how she would respond. Her dress, once pristine, was now covered in cake, and her hair was a mess. But she didn't care about that. The bigger question was what to do next. How would she handle this? She had never imagined her wedding day would take such a turn. She had always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, but this was far from it. For a moment, Emily was paralyzed, her heart aching with every second that passed. The world around her seemed to blur, and she could feel the weight of everyone's gaze. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, she knew she had to make a decision. She couldn't stand there forever. She couldn't let this moment define her. With a deep breath, Emily slowly reached up and wiped the cake off her face. Her hands trembled, but she remained steady. The silence was thick, and she could hear her own heartbeat as she tried to gather her thoughts. The room seemed to be waiting for her to say something, to make sense of the situation. But what could she say? What could she do? In that moment, she realized something. This wasn't about the cake. This was about something far deeper, and Emily was ready to face it, no matter the cost. The room was heavy with silence, the shock of what had just happened hanging in the air like an invisible weight. The guests, still stunned, watched as Emily stood there, cake smeared across her face and her wedding dress. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What had just happened? How could Alex, the man she was about to marry, do something like this in front of everyone? She couldn't make sense of it, and yet it was impossible to ignore. Alex stood there as well, frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and frustration. He had clearly acted on impulse, his anger taking over in that moment. The expression on his face wasn't one of joy or celebration, but one of regret. Emily could see it, but it didn't change what had just occurred. The damage had been done. Her heart ached with the realization that something fundamental had changed between them, something that couldn't easily be fixed. Emily felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions bubbling to the surface. She wanted to scream, to demand an explanation. But she held it in. She had always prided herself on staying calm and composed, even when life threw its hardest challenges at her. But this was different. This wasn't just an awkward moment. It was a breach of trust. A moment where her groom had done something that felt like a betrayal. The guests began to murmur, some unsure of how to react, others clearly uncomfortable with the tension that was now hanging thick in the air. Emily could hear a few quiet voices from the crowd, whispers that only made the situation more unbearable. Everyone was waiting for something, but Emily wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next. She was still trying to process what had happened and the hurt she felt. How could she just move past this? For what seemed like an eternity, Emily stood still, her hands trembling as she wiped cake from her face. She glanced over at Alex, hoping for an apology, an explanation, or even an apology for what he had done. But he just stood there, looking at her with wide eyes, as though he too was waiting for something, waiting for the right words to make everything better. But Emily didn't need words right now. She needed actions, and so far, all she had seen were impulsive, hurtful gestures. And yet, even through the cloud of confusion and hurt, Emily knew she had to act. She couldn't just stand there and let the day continue as though nothing had happened. She had to make a choice, and in that moment, she realized something powerful. She had the strength to decide how this story would end. No matter what Alex did or didn't do, she could control her own response. With a deep breath, Emily stood tall, her back straightening as she brushed more cake off her dress. The guests were still watching, their eyes glued to the unfolding drama. Emily could feel their gazes, but she knew that her next move had to be one for herself. She didn't need anyone's approval. This was her life, her moment, and she was the one who had to decide what came next. She turned to Alex, her eyes steady and unflinching. There was no more room for confusion or hesitation. She had been wronged, but she would not let it define her. The room fell completely silent as Emily, with a calm but firm voice, spoke. "If this is how you want to treat me, then I won't stay for it. I don't deserve this." Her words rang out in the quiet room, and for the first time that evening, Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The decision was clear. She didn't need to settle for disrespect. She had spent so long imagining this day as the beginning of something beautiful, but sometimes the end had to come before a new beginning could take place. Alex stood motionless, clearly taken aback by her words. His mouth opened as though to speak, but he was at a loss. Emily didn't wait for him. She didn't need him to explain anything anymore. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit, the clattering of her heels the only sound in the stillness of the room. She didn't look back. As Emily walked away from the stunned crowd, her heart raced with a mix of emotions. There was the sting of hurt, the sharpness of betrayal, but also a surprising sense of clarity. The wedding that she had imagined for so long, the one that should have been full of joy and celebration, had turned into something entirely different. But in that moment, Emily knew one thing for sure. She couldn't stay in a situation where she felt disrespected, no matter how much she had once hoped for the fairy tale ending. The cool evening air hit her as she stepped outside, the bustling noise of the reception still faintly echoing behind her. She didn't know where she was going, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was leaving behind a moment of her life that no longer felt like hers. It was as if the weight of the situation had lifted, and the fresh air gave her a new sense of freedom. The wedding was over, but Emily had just started something new, her own path. For the first time that night, Emily allowed herself to breathe deeply, to really feel what was happening. She wasn't just walking away from a wedding. She was walking away from something that no longer felt right. The past few months, the excitement of planning the perfect day, had been tainted by the nagging feeling that something wasn't aligning. Now, standing outside in the cool night air, Emily realized that she had been blind to the signs for far too long. She had allowed herself to believe that everything would fall into place, that love would conquer all. But love wasn't supposed to feel like this. Love was supposed to lift you up, not make you question your worth. As she walked away, she noticed a few of her closest friends trailing behind her. They had been watching from a distance, unsure of how to react, but now they were offering her silent support. They didn't need to say anything. They just followed her, a steady presence in a moment where everything felt uncertain. Emily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She didn't need to face this alone. Her friends, the people who truly cared for her, were there for her when it mattered most. The streets were quiet, the hustle of the reception far behind. Emily and her friends walked in silence, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. She didn't need to explain herself. They understood. They didn't need to ask if she was okay. Emily knew that right now she didn't need to be okay. She needed to be true to herself. She needed to find the strength to let go of what had been, to embrace the future, no matter how uncertain it seemed. They made their way to a nearby cafe, where the soft hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups felt like a welcome contrast to the chaos she had left behind. It wasn't a grand celebration, but it was a celebration of Emily's courage. As she sat down with her friends, they surrounded her with warmth and care. There were no pitying looks, no need for words of comfort that might have felt hollow. Instead, there was just understanding. "I'm proud of you," one of her friends said softly. Emily looked up, meeting her friend's eyes. It was a small moment, but in that moment, she realized something powerful. She was proud of herself too. She had walked away when she could have stayed, when it would have been easier to ignore the red flags and pretend that everything was fine. But Emily wasn't interested in easy anymore. She was interested in being true to herself, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The night went on, and while it wasn't the way she had imagined her wedding day ending, Emily knew that she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. The future might not be certain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. With the support of her friends and the newfound strength in her heart, Emily was ready to write her own story on her terms. And no matter what, she would never settle for anything less than the respect and love she deserved. As Emily sat at the small cafe with her friends, the quiet hum of the city outside seemed to fade away. The world felt distant, as though she were in her own little bubble, away from the shock of the wedding and the emotional whirlwind that had followed. The evening had taken a sharp turn, and now, with her friends by her side, she felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of happiness that she had once dreamed of for her wedding day, but it was the peace of clarity. She was no longer caught up in a situation that didn't serve her. She had made a choice, one that was difficult but necessary. Her friends, who had quietly followed her out of the reception, were now sitting with her, offering their quiet support. They didn't ask a million questions, they didn't bombard her with advice, and they certainly didn't try to convince her to go back to the wedding. Instead, they sat with her in comfortable silence, their presence enough to remind her that she wasn't alone in this moment. In fact, the more she thought about it, the more Emily realized how much this moment of stillness was helping her heal. "Do you want to talk about it?" one of her friends, Laura, asked gently, sipping her coffee. Emily looked up, taking a deep breath. She hadn't had the chance to speak to anyone about what had happened. She didn't know where to start. There was so much to say, but the words didn't come easily. For a few moments, Emily just stared into her cup, her hands wrapped around it for comfort. It wasn't about the cake or the wedding or even the mess it had all turned into. It was about what she had been avoiding for so long. Her feelings had been buried under layers of excitement and plans for the future, but now they were rising to the surface. It felt like a wave threatening to crash over her, but Emily wasn't afraid to face it. "I don't know what happened," Emily finally said, her voice soft but steady. "I thought everything was fine. I thought we were fine. But then, I don't know. I guess I was blind to everything I didn't want to see. I ignored the signs, the way he acted, the things I should have paid attention to. And now, here I am." Laura nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You didn't ignore it on purpose. You were just trying to make it work, like anyone would. But now you've seen it for what it is. And you're stronger for it." Emily gave a small, grateful smile. It felt good to hear those words. She hadn't realized until now how much she needed to hear them. It was easy to feel guilty for walking away, to doubt her decision, but hearing her friend's support gave her the reassurance she needed. There was no shame in making the choice to protect herself. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of gentle conversation and quiet moments of reflection. Emily wasn't ready to dive deep into her feelings yet, but just being in the presence of people who cared about her helped her process what had happened. She wasn't ready to forgive Alex for what he had done, nor was she certain what would come next. But one thing was clear: this was a turning point, and she wasn't going to let it define her in a negative way. By the time the cafe was nearly empty, Emily felt like she had made the right choice. She was in control of her own life again. She had walked away from something that had turned toxic, and now she had the opportunity to rebuild. Slowly, but surely, she could start again. It was going to take time, and there would be moments when she would feel sad or disappointed, but she knew that this was the right path. Her friends walked her to her car, each one offering their support in their own way, some with quiet words, others with a gentle hug. Emily smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude for them that she hadn't fully understood before. She wasn't alone. She was surrounded by people who truly cared for her, and that was what mattered. As she drove home, the night sky stretched out before her, vast and full of possibilities. Emily didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time that evening, she felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms, and that, she knew, was the beginning of something new. The next few days were a blur for Emily. She didn't expect everything to feel like a sudden, smooth transition. There was so much to process, so much to reflect on. She didn't want to think about the wedding or Alex right now. She just wanted to breathe and focus on herself for a while. The first thing she did was turn off her phone. She didn't want any messages, calls, or anyone trying to explain or justify what had happened. She needed space. She needed time to figure out what her next steps would be, without the pressure of others' opinions. At first, it was hard. The silence felt heavy, and Emily found herself questioning her decisions at every turn. What had gone wrong? Why hadn't she seen the warning signs earlier? Her thoughts would spiral into confusion and doubt, but she quickly reminded herself that she had done the right thing. She had walked away from a situation that was no longer serving her, from someone who, in that moment, didn't show the respect and care she deserved. Her friends kept in touch, but in a more respectful, gentle way, offering her the space she needed while still making sure she knew they were there if she needed them. Laura had been the most supportive, checking in regularly with just a simple text or a phone call, making sure Emily knew she wasn't alone. Emily appreciated that more than she could express. There were no pressures, no demands, just the steady presence of people who cared about her. One afternoon, about a week after the wedding, Emily found herself standing in front of the mirror in her bedroom. Her wedding dress, still hanging in the closet, stared back at her, a constant reminder of everything that had happened. She had told herself she would donate it or put it away, but every time she tried, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she let the memory of the dress become a symbol of her growth, not her loss. It wasn't about the dress, it was about her. She realized that she had been so focused on planning her life around someone else's expectations that she forgot to focus on her own. It was time to stop living for others and start living for herself. With that thought, she slowly began taking steps forward. She started by clearing out the clutter from her life, both physical and emotional. She donated the things that reminded her of her past, things that tied her to a version of herself she was ready to leave behind. The decision to start over wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Emily didn't need a perfect future. She needed a future that was true to who she was, free from the shadows of uncertainty and manipulation. She began to embrace her freedom, slowly getting back into her routine, spending more time on things that made her happy. She picked up her hobbies again, like painting and journaling, activities that had always brought her peace. One afternoon, Emily decided to visit a small art gallery she had been meaning to check out for months. Walking through the galleries, surrounded by beautiful works of art, she felt a sense of calm that had eluded her for weeks. Each painting, each sculpture told a story, and Emily realized that she too had a story that was still unfolding. The gallery visit became a turning point for her. She saw the beauty in the chaos, the strength in vulnerability. She realized that her story wasn't over. She had the power to write the next chapter, and it was up to her how it would unfold. When Emily returned home that evening, she felt different, lighter. The weight of the past few weeks wasn't gone, but it didn't hold her as tightly anymore. She had given herself permission to heal, to move on, and to find peace within herself. It wasn't going to be an easy journey, but she knew now that it was one she was ready for. That night, as she lay in bed, Emily smiled to herself. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. She had her whole life ahead of her, and this time, it would be on her terms. As the days turned into weeks, Emily continued to find her footing in the new life she was building for herself. The transition wasn't instant, but each step she took felt like a small victory. The initial pain of the wedding day, the confusion, the hurt, slowly began to fade into the background, replaced with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't where she had planned to be, but she was exactly where she needed to be. She was learning to prioritize herself, to care for herself in ways she hadn't before. Her friends were still by her side, offering their unwavering support. Laura, in particular, had been her rock, always there when Emily needed someone to talk to or just to laugh with. Emily had opened up to her about the pain she had felt, the doubts she had struggled with. And while her friends couldn't change what had happened, they helped her see the strength within herself, reminding her that she had made the right choice, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. One day, after finishing a quiet lunch with Laura, Emily decided it was time to take another step. She was ready to tackle the wedding dress hanging in her closet. The dress was beautiful, but it was a symbol of a life that no longer fit her. It was time to let go of the last tangible reminder of the life she had tried to build with Alex. She took the dress in her hands and held it for a moment, feeling its softness and remembering the hope she had once placed in it. But that hope had shifted. She wasn't the same person who had imagined herself walking down the aisle in it. She was someone stronger, someone who had learned the importance of self-respect and independence. With a deep breath, she carefully folded the dress and placed it in a box. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about making room for the future. Emily didn't immediately throw the dress away, but she knew she would. It was just a matter of time before it found a new purpose, or perhaps even a new owner who would wear it with joy, not sadness. The act of folding it and putting it away felt freeing. It was another piece of her healing, another step forward in her journey toward the person she was becoming. The more Emily focused on herself, the more she realized that she didn't need anyone else to define her happiness. She began to take small trips on her own, exploring new places in the city, visiting parks, going for walks, and trying new activities. It wasn't about filling the emptiness with distractions. It was about discovering parts of herself she had ignored while she was focused on someone else. She joined a book club, attended a few local art exhibitions, and even began taking yoga classes. Slowly but surely, Emily was rediscovering her passions, the things that made her feel alive. One evening, she found herself standing on the balcony of her apartment, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the quiet of the moment felt like a reflection of the peace she was beginning to find within herself. She no longer felt the weight of the past dragging her down. The future, though uncertain, now felt full of potential. Emily didn't know what her future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited about it. She wasn't waiting for someone else to make her happy. She was making herself happy. She was taking control of her own life, and that was the most empowering feeling she could have imagined. The woman she was becoming was someone who valued herself, someone who wasn't afraid to walk away from what wasn't right, and someone who was finally ready to embrace the life she deserved. As she turned away from the balcony and made her way back inside, she smiled to herself. The past was a part of her story, but it didn't define her. What defined her now was the strength, the growth, and the determination to keep moving forward. And no matter what the future held, Emily knew one thing for sure. She would face it on her own terms, with her head held high and her heart open to whatever came next.